Okay, so now that we're kind of introduced to Collagraph, what I want to do is talk about the creation of your plates today. So I'm going to move the screen down so that you can see my work area. Can you all still hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so in terms of materials, a lot of what we're using are going to be found materials. So we're not looking to purchase materials like we would with a linoleum block. So what I have here is a bunch of scrap board that came from the backs of old scrapbooks and notebooks. I'm working with a relatively thin piece, mainly because I want to create a number of different shapes. And so I don't want to have to use a lot of effort in kind of trying to carve or cut through really thick boards. Sometimes scrapbooks can have, or sketchbooks rather, can have really thick backers. That will work totally fine, but it'll obviously be a little bit more difficult to cut around. Part of this project is to create a variety of blocks, of plates rather, so that you can start to puzzle piece and intermingle them together. We toyed around with that idea a little bit in the critique today, and I think that this is where you can really start to investigate with that more. It could mean perhaps different landscapes that can be changed around, or different geometric shapes that kind of can fit within one another, or even something completely abstract that can start to morph and change over the course of a series of prints. So once you have your chipboard as a base, you can start to look for found materials to use. Some really above and beyond the chipboard itself. In some of the examples, you've seen embroidery thread. I like using embroidery thread instead of yarn because yarn is very thick and tends to hold on to a lot of ink. The more ink that holds onto, the kind of more blurry the image can become, where embroidery floss, is a bit more substantial than a traditional thread, and so it will actually create a line in your print that's a bit distinguishable, but it's not thick enough that it'll hold too much ink and start to really bleed out over the course of your paper. So embroidery thread is a great piece of material. Also, packaging materials are awesome. I have kind of this thicker, kind of more higher density foam that came in a package that I had. Bubble wrap is wonderful and creates some really interesting textures. In some of the examples, there was bubble wrap. Any array of fabrics, if you have swatches, are great. Lace really shows up beautifully. As well as kind of thicker gauged paper like watercolor papers or cardstock. That's thin enough that it'll give you just a light haloing around any image that you create with it, but not so much that it's going to create larger, whiter areas in your image space. And then you also saw the use of some sandpaper in some of the pieces, and this gives you a really nice overall general tone to an area. Obviously, the rougher the sandpaper, the more ink it's going to hold, so the darker the image is. So you can even play, perhaps your entire print is just different grades of sandpaper to see those transitions in the tones and how those all interact with one another. But again, even just working solely with the chipboard can give you a lot to work with as well. The benefit of the chipboard as well is because it's easy to draw on and to work with, but also should you make shapes that aren't this kind of traditional rectangular form, you have the ability to cut with both a box cutter or even scissors if you're working with this thinner material. Or a X-Acto knife or scalpel as well. One other thing you're going to need for this project is some type of adhesive. You can use Elmer's glue and the like for this, just know that that takes a little bit of time to dry. What I like to use in my studio, as well as on campus if we were in the print studio, is PVA. This is a pH neutral adhesive. It looks and reacts much like Elmer's glue and other craft glues, but it dries a lot faster. And so it's not going to dry fast enough where you have to rush in your making. But if you were to tack something down within like a minute or so, it is secure enough, even though it's drying, that it's not going to move around on you, where sometimes Elmer's glues and craft glues can take a lot longer. PVA is available at most craft stores. It is widely available online. It is not necessary for you to get in order to work on this project, but it is an adhesive that I recommend kind of across art making, because it is that faster drying but still workable time frame. And it's also pH neutral, so it's acid free and will be archival for your work, whether you're creating with paper or any other type of material. The pH neutrality isn't necessarily super useful right now because chipboard itself isn't pH neutral. It's actually a bit acidic, but in working perhaps with your final prints, I know we talked about some of you cutting your prints and re-adhering and things like that, using a pH neutral glue or any adhesive is what I recommend in kind of working with your final prints and back into them. A brush for applying said adhesives, and then once you've finished creating your piece, you're going to need to seal this. And so using any type of spray, shellac or polyurethane, what this is going to do is going to create a barrier in between the absorbency of your chipboard and the inks that we're using. So here, if I were to put ink on top of this board, it's going to soak into the board and make it very difficult for me to change colors if I were to change the way I was printing over the course of a number of prints. Like our linoleum, that was very easy to clean off and then reapply a new ink. This not so much unless it's sealed. And so a spray shellac, spray polyurethane, liquid polyurethane or liquid shellac, anything that's kind of an enamel that will coat this will work fine. So if you have something in your studios or in your workspace right now and you're not sure, send me an email with the specs on it and I can let you know if it's either good to go or we're looking for something else. But you're not going to need to use that until you've completed the creation of your block process and let all of the materials dry. So once you've gathered all your materials and you have everything ready to work, you can start to develop your project. So for this demo piece, I'm going to create just a couple of leaf shapes, just for the sake of not going too far in depth, but I will have the week to develop this more so that when it comes time to print this next week, you'll have a good idea on the variability of what the techniques have to offer. So right now I'm just drawing out these specific shapes. Again, I'm not going to take too much time. And you can cut these out with an X-Acto knife. Again, this works best if you have a thinner piece of chipboard than some of the backs of some of your sketchbooks. This one's almost there with just one pass of the scalpel. There we go. So once this kind of starts to remove itself, I now have this smaller piece of chipboard now. I'm just going to clean up the edges a little bit with these scissors because I don't want any of that remaining fuzz of that chipboard to remain. So I have this piece, and then I'm also going to cut out this one. I'm going to use the scissors for this because this piece is thin enough for me to work without too much difficulty with the scissors. So the beauty of this too is if you're working with chipboard that's on the thinner side, is you can get particularly intricate with the shapes that you're forming in your chipboard. Obviously, also using an X-Acto knife gives you a bit more mobility around those finer corners as well. I don't ever throw away pieces like this because I'm going to start to build up the chipboard on the surface of this as well. So once I have my base of my plates in order, now I want to start to build up that texture. But I'm not only building up texture, I'm kind of building up topography on the piece of chipboard itself. So anywhere that is recessed, I have the ability to perhaps not have it catch ink at all, much like in our relief prints. If we carved it away, a roller wouldn't touch it. We have the opportunity now that we can have that happen where the ink won't touch in open areas, but also we have the ability to have one color deep within the plate. And then if we were to roll over this with the hard roller, because that hard roller wouldn't dip into a recessed area, it would leave the ink that was there before. So to kind of create these recessed areas within your block, what you want to do is start to cut into the chipboard, but not go all the way through it. What we're looking for is to remove some of the layers of the chipboard, but keeping just a little bit of the base, so that way there's a spot for that ink to land. You can also cut all the way through the chipboard, allowing a completely lightened area that won't catch any ink at all. So once you've kind of carved a surface into the block, I'm going to take my scalpel and just start to peel up the layers of the chipboard. So you can see here that I'm exposing some deeper area of the chipboard. And that first initial layer, if I can, in feeling it, I don't have much of a dip between the surface here and then what I've just recessed. So I want to take a little bit more of this away. Again, doing the same thing, just lifting up some of the layers of the chipboard. There we go. And then taking it and peeling it away. I may need to, in certain instances, kind of peel off certain spots and then kind of work more in those areas to make sure that it's flatter. And I can feel now when I'm looking at that, you can even see, even though this is a little bit of a less detailed image, that slight shadow from where this is to what's in here. And so again, when I roll over this, this will catch ink and this will not, or at least not as much. And so I have the ability to differentiate two different color inks or no ink and ink. In the same respect, I could, instead of recessing into the chipboard, I can also build up and create peaks with more chipboard as well. So if I were to cut a form here, I can use some of the PVA, apply some glue to the surface. Of course, there we go. Apply some glue to the surface here. Oh. So what I get for not using this for a while. There we go. So here, I guess I'll just use the brush in this sense to apply some of the adhesive onto the surface of the chipboard, and then securely adhere then this higher piece of chipboard onto the surface of my leaf. So here you can now see I have three different levels now on this piece. I have the original, I have this peak, and then I have this valley. So all of which are going to give me some differentiations in how this inks and then transfers onto the print, but also where I can add different colors. Now I could work solely on using this to create differentiation. I can also use, this is an awl for bookbinding. Hole punches can work too. So I can take this and press holes and create kind of smaller openings into the block that won't catch ink. So it's all about now deciding where these textures are going to be and where then you're going to want ink to be a little bit more saturated or lighter. This technique involves a little bit more loss of control, which I can totally understand because it's myself included. That's sometimes a little difficult to do because while you're creating these textures, unlike relief where you could color over with the Sharpie and kind of know what's going to happen, until you ink this, you won't really know how these textures are going to interact with one another. So you're creating something and releasing a little bit of that control to the printmaking process. So in the creation of shapes and details, you can get what you're looking for, but until you start to print, you may find you need to add to it. You can always glue on top of a sealed block. So just because it's shellacked doesn't mean that you can't clean your plate off and start to play with it more and then just reseal it again if you were to add any new materials to it. So you have a little bit more flexibility here in that should you make something and not like it, I could peel this off right now and kind of revert back a little bit to square one or completely cut a new shape. So you have more flexibility and forgiveness in this technique than you did with the relief printing. To adhere textures onto your blocks, it's going to be the exact same thing as applying the chipboard. You're going to want to cut, rip, develop the shapes that you want onto the surface of your blocks, and then adhere them the exact same way. So again, with a brush or with you can use glue sticks for some materials, but I find that they're a little difficult to really apply enough glue to hold something down. The last thing you want is to have something peel off of your block in the middle of printing. So you want to really make sure that everything is securely adhered and then also dry. I wouldn't want to go and seal this immediately because I want to make sure that all of this is dry. So in a few minutes, it'll be good. And I'm going to talk about the spray shellacking, but I'm not going to do that inside my studio because you want to be in a well-ventilated area when you're using any type of aerosol. So if I had paint shellac or paint polyurethane, I could absolutely paint this in my studio space. Again, it's a fuming type material. And so even in your spaces, depending on where you are, you're going to want to have good ventilation. And it's still nice enough outside that I would highly recommend anyone that's sealing their plates to do that outside so that off-gassing isn't going to cause you any issues. If we were in the studio, we would be using a venting system to keep all of this aerosol out of your area. So any aerosol, use outside in a well-ventilated space. Even if you're painting it, I recommend doing that outside just so that you are breathing fresh, clean air and none of that's going to be in your work area. So when I am finished creating my plates, multiple, then I'm ready to apply this. If you're using an aerosol like this or an aerosol polyurethane, what you're going to want to do is to apply a coat on the front 3 times and on the back twice. You don't need to do the back as much because it's not actually touching ink or not as much ink. But if you're on the surface here, we want to have a nice solid application so that way you can clean your plates easier. If you're using textures that are really delicate, like sandpaper or making really subtle changes between the surface of your chipboard and recessed areas, I would recommend using aerosol because it's not going to apply an application too thickly, like you would perhaps if you were painting it yourself with a paintable version. because we don't want to lose the textures and the shifts in the topography of your plate. If you're working with a rather graphic plate that has maybe a lot of just wide openings or larger areas of texture, then painting on the polyurethane or the shellac should work just fine. And if that's the case, painting it, you really only need to, I would recommend do 2 on the front and 1 on the back. Again, so that you're sealing the back so that you can clean without worry, but most of the resistance then to the ink and to any type of wiping and cleaning will come off with ease because this is fully sealed. So the length at which we're working really involves the plate creation here. So once you get, much like your relief prints, once you spend all that work making your plate, the inking process is pretty consistent. So here it's very much the same, but we're actually creating a plate from scratch as opposed to drawing and then carving in a pre-existing plate. So you have the ability to be particularly open and imaginative with what you make, as well as having these puzzle pieces. So for this project, there we go, you're being asked to create, again, a suite of prints. Let me pull up your project. So you are creating a multiple Collagraph plate series of prints. So again, you're gonna submit 8 prints. And what I mean by series in this is like our first project, unlike our first project rather, that was an addition, even if it was a variable, because your block remained absolutely consistent in its imagery the whole time because that didn't really change. Colors may have changed, and that means that it's a variable addition. But here you're making a series, and a series means that there's a thread that connects these all in a similar fashion, but things can change and be perhaps a bit more drastically different from print to print. So if we're making multiple plates, perhaps in one print there's 4 or 5 leaves, but then in another one there's only 1 leaf, and that would mean that there's a series. So each print is particularly different from the last, but they are a family. So you have an extended family of prints that will allow you this flexibility and a bit more experimentation as you start to print. So like some of you found in your relief prints that you wanted to do something a bit more unique or change something up after you started printing where it wasn't as easy to do when you had the relief block. Here you have that flexibility. So say you're making a print that's largely geometric like Marcus may be working on. There you can start to puzzle piece a lot of different components, but perhaps it reads too busy in one print. Going on to your next, you remove a couple of those chunks of your Collagraph plates and then print again. Or maybe it reads better if they're inked in a different way and scattered instead of a bit more structured. So there's a lot more that you can do here and experiment with. And the size of your plate is different. So you were all working with that 5 by 7 inch relief block, where here you can work almost to the size of your paper. You could work larger if you have larger sheets of paper, or like I am here, this is only maybe 1 inch by 3 inches, and I have the multitude of different layers that I can pull. Some of you worked with layering one on top of the other, so I could pull a Collagraph plate all up against each other, but then re-evaluate them in their ghost. We'll talk about the ghost print next week when I'm inking, and then reprint. And so I have 2 different tones and values of the same imagery that's kind of layered on top of one another. Do you have any questions right now about plate creation? You're welcome to throw them into the chat or come off of mute.
So it seems like pretty free that, you know, we can just get crazy, try something and see, oh, okay, too crazy, going back. But you know, it's like very open. Okay, as long as we are building like a collage with these textures, whatever, and print it. Perfect.
Yeah, so you have a more openness in terms of what your plate becomes. I still like to open the door to you. I know some of you maybe had a little bit of difficulty getting the gears turning for that first project, and this giving you even a little bit more freedom. If anybody needs a really vague theme to use as a jumping off point, I'm more than happy to give that to you. But I think you all had really started to develop some solid content or are working with some really solid work from before and bringing that into print. So I would urge you to continue to kind of investigate those things, but in this process, in this technique. What I really like about Collagraph is that it's exceptionally approachable and a plate that you can make no matter really what your circumstances are or where you're working. And it doesn't need specialized materials like the linoleum, even though that's a very basic material to create with. So this kind of opens the door to what printing can be for anyone working in any space. All right, I'm going to stop the recording.